Thank you for joining the RTC's Metropolitan Planning Subcommittee meeting. Chair Murphy, staff is ready for you to begin.
Thank you. Good morning. Chair Johanna Murphy for the record. I'd like to call to order the July 14, 2020 meeting of the RTC Metropolitan Planning Subcommittee. RTC staff will begin with a roll call of subcommittee members, introduce staff on the line, and touch on a few housekeeping items.
Thank you, Chair Murphy. Maren Dubois, Management Analyst for the RTC for the record. I will be calling your name in alphabetical order. Please confirm your attendance as I read your name. Mario Bermudez.
Here.
Demetrius Karapanagiatis.
Present.
Johanna Murphy.
Present.
April Raybuck.
Present.
Richard Sechrist.
Present.
Fred Solis.
Present.
Kimberly Sullivan.
Present.
And Kevin Very. Kevin, do we still have you on here? There he is. Thank you. Also, please note that we have several RTC staff on the line for today's meeting. This includes Mr. Craig Rayborn, Director of MPO, Mr. Andrew Kelman, Manager of Transportation Planning, Ms. Ray Lathrop, Manager of Regional Planning, Beth Shea, Manager of Transportation Planning, Ms. Deb Reardon, Principal Transportation Planner, Lijuan Su, Senior Transportation Planner, and Ms. Eileen Pastor, Government Affairs Supervisor, will be reading public comments. Additionally, Mr. Jared Tasco from the Clark County will be making a presentation. As the chairwoman mentioned, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. Please state your name for the record before speaking. Be sure to mute your line if you are not speaking, but please note the staff will monitor lines and mute any callers that have background noise. Voting will be done verbally as a group, calling for ayes and nays. If there are no nays or abstentions, then the motion will carry. If there are nays, then a roll call vote will be required. In the event of a roll call vote, please wait for your name to be read to provide your vote. The chair will call for any comments or questions after an item has been presented. Thank you, Chair Murphy.
Thank you. I will turn it over to you, Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Chairwoman Murphy and members of the subcommittee. Craig Rayborn, Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, for the record. The first item on the agenda is to conduct your first citizens participation period. As you know, on March 22nd, 2020, the State of Nevada Executive Department issued Declaration of Emergency Directive 006, which suspended the requirement to have a physical location for public meetings. Pursuant to Directive 006 and for the health and safety of the community, this meeting is being held telephonically. To allow for public participation, the RTC is accepting public comments via email at publiccomments@rtcsnv.com. Comments can be submitted to be read aloud or to be added directly to the written record. Ms. Eileen Pastor, Government Affairs Supervisor, will read the public comments received by the RTC.
Thank you. Chairwoman Johanna Murphy for the record. This is the first time set aside for public comment. This time is limited to comments on items included on the agenda. Comments will be limited to the first 500 words, with the remaining words to be included in the written record. Do we have any comments?
Thank you, Chairwoman Murphy. Eileen Pastor, RTC Government Affairs Supervisor for the record, and there are no public comments to a posted agenda item.
Okay. Thank you. Eileen, moving on, Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next item on the agenda is to designate officers for 2020 to 2021. The policies and procedures of the RTC provide that the chair and vice chair of the Metropolitan Planning Subcommittee be rotated alphabetically by entity. The new chair and vice chair are to be designated at the first meeting in July to serve for the following 12 months. The current chair is the representative of the city of North Las Vegas, and the current vice chair is the representative of the Clark County School District. Under the policies and procedures, the next agency in alphabetical order to hold the chair is the representative from the Clark County School District. The vice chair would rotate to the representative of the Nevada Department of Transportation. Both the representatives from CCSD and NDOT have agreed to fill these roles. If the subcommittee approves, the CCSD representative, Mr. Demetrios Karapanagiotis, will conduct the rest of the meeting. Chairwoman Murphy.
Thank you, Craig. Are there any comments or questions from the subcommittee? Okay. Hearing none, do we have a motion on the floor?
This is Mario with Clark County for the record. I motion for approval.
Okay. We have a motion from subcommittee member Bermudez. All those in favor say aye.
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 Okay. I don't hear any objections, so therefore the motion carries. Mr. Rayborn?
Thank you, Ms. Murphy. Again, Craig Rayborn for the record. On behalf of the RTC, I'd like to thank you for serving as chair of the MPS for the past year. We appreciate your time and support of the RTC. I also want to thank the representatives from CCSD and NDOT for their willingness to participate as chair and vice chair on the subcommittee. With that, Chair Demetrios Karapanagiotis, we are ready to move on to the next item on the agenda. And that next item is to approve the consent agenda, which consists of items 3 and 4 and may be taken in one motion.
Thank you, Mr. Rayburn. Chair Dimitrios Karapanagiotis for the record. Are there any comments or questions from the subcommittee? I hear none. If there's no more questions or comments, do we have a motion on the floor?
Hi, Johanna Murphy for the record. Move to approve the consent agenda.
We have a motion for approval. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I hear none. The motion carries. Mr. Rayburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Craig Rayborn for the record. Our next item is to approve the Southern Nevada Coordinated Public Transit Human Services Transportation Plan, or Coordinated Plan. The Coordinated Plan aims to enhance mobility for seniors, people with disabilities, and low-income individuals. Ms. Deb Reardon, Principal Transportation Planner for the RTC, will provide details on the Coordinated Plan. Deb?
Thank you, Craig, and good morning, everyone. I'm Deb Reardon for the record, and during May, we shared an update on the coordinated plan as we kicked off the public comment period. So today, as the committee considers approval, I'll provide a quick recap, share input that we received during this comment period, and also next steps. Next slide, please. And there we go. Perfect. Thanks. So just by way of background, the plan brings together public, private, and nonprofit transportation and human service providers and really serves as a forum for coordination, for leveraging resources, and working to fill transportation gaps together. The MPO serves as a convener for this plan, which is developed and implemented by many organizations across the county. And the plan also meets federal transit law requirements. Projects that are funded by Section 5310, which is the Enhanced Mobility for Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities program, must also be included in a locally developed coordinated plan. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the plan, it's a 4 to 5 year document that really focuses on the transportation needs of some of our most vulnerable populations. Since the last plan was developed in 2015, the number of people with disabilities, seniors, and low-income individuals and their transportation needs have continued to increase and are continuing to change during the pandemic, which makes this plan especially timely. So how did we do it? Next slide, please. The first steps included evaluating existing conditions and a gap analysis, including reviewing past plans, identifying existing services through an inventory that included about over 100 providers, and identifying gaps. This information served as a basis to develop goals, strategies, and an implementation plan. The plan was developed through the input of many organizations through techniques like stakeholder meetings, interviews, roundtables. We also went to several existing partner meetings and committee and public meetings. So as a result of this outreach, we developed the following goals. Next slide. Thanks. So first, continuing to expand the capacity and transportation services that are available to populations of all abilities and means. Second, regularly educating and informing residents and visitors of all of the services and resources that are available through more user-friendly and accessible tools. Third, exploring the use of emerging mobility options that would complement our existing transportation services. Also, improving connections to transit, optimizing land use, improving bicycle and pedestrian facilities, and working to expand those first and last mile trips. And then lastly, continuing to expand on existing coordination and collaboration efforts between nonprofits and government agencies. So from these goals, over 30 strategies were developed, including policy, program, service, and infrastructure improvements that are outlined in the document. Next slide. Thanks. So the draft was available in May, and I'll just share 5 themes that we heard during the public comment period and also through stakeholder and committee meetings that will be reflected in the final draft. So first, partners shared that there are impacts from the pandemic on providing transportation, including social distancing impacts on shared rides, declining revenue, and then also just the need to coordinate sanitation and other protocols across providers. So these topics will be included in plan strategies and also in the plan conclusion. Second, we also heard that the transportation needs for low-income youth are continuing to grow. And based on this input, the plan has been updated to reflect transportation barriers of reaching schools, also after school activities when school is back in session, and then also the need for more equitable transportation options to charter schools. So additionally, actions to provide more transit information, and also to help facilitate more bus pass signups for youth have been added to the plan. Third, we heard that there's continues to be a lack of accessible TNC vehicles through like Uber and Lyft was also identified as a barrier. So we added an action to work with TNC companies or transportation network companies to expand the availability of accessible vehicles within the document. We also heard that accessible paths of travel are an issue in rural areas in addition to near transit. So the strategy of improving accessible paths of travel has been updated to reflect this need. And lastly, there's an ongoing interest to serve people that are outside of the paratransit boundary. And this is addressed through strategies such as exploring more on-demand services. So our next steps include review by committees. We're at the MPS today, and then we have review by the TAC and EAC later this month, followed by RTC board in July. And then the committee has also decided to meet quarterly to facilitate implementation with a first meeting that's already been scheduled in August. So this concludes my presentation, and I will be happy to answer any questions that the subcommittee has.
Do we have any questions or any comments from any member? I hear none. So if there are no more questions or comments, do we have a motion on the floor?
Hi, Johanna Murphy for the record. Just a point of clarification. Are we approving this or accepting the report?
From what I see on the record is to approve it. Is that correct, Mr. Rayburn?
Yeah, again, this is Craig Rayborn. For the record, yes, that is the motion that staff is seeking.
Okay, well then I will go ahead and make a motion to approve the report.
We have a motion for approval. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? I hear none. The motion carries. Mr. Rayburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Craig Rayborn for the record. The next item on the agenda is to approve the onboard regional mobility plan. I'll wait for the slides to advance. Okay, next slide, please. So today I'm going to review the onboard plan, which we have completed with substantial input and assistance from our partner agencies represented on this committee, as well as many other stakeholders. And I should note up front that staff is seeking a recommendation for approval of the plan, including the 8 strategies and the 64 implementing projects. So first, I want to review the outreach and engagement activities we've conducted during the development of this plan. The outreach and engagement, go ahead, next slide, please. The outreach and engagement efforts we've conducted for Onboard are the most extensive ever undertaken by the RTC. Over the past nearly 3 years, we've had a presence at more than 300 events. We've given more than 110 speaking engagements. We've had nearly 90,000 in-person contacts. And across the 3 onboard surveys, we've had more than 30,000 responses. We have, next slide, please. We've also had 18 technical advisory group meetings with local agency planners, public works departments, and other partners. We've also held 4 community stakeholder meetings at key points in the plan development process. Next slide. So as I prepare to quickly review the 8 onboard strategies, this is probably the right time to acknowledge, the realities of the moment that we're in right now. So onboard, is an aspirational plan intended to lay out a long-term vision for what mobility and transit in Southern Nevada should look like in 20 or more years. At the same time, we, the RTC, at the same time that we are moving this plan forward, we are also facing an unprecedented funding and transit crisis as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recession it has triggered. So while we are proposing a visionary plan that would obviously take significant resources to implement, the RTC is simultaneously proposing transit changes that would result in a near-term contraction of services. So as our region's metropolitan planning organization, it's very important that we continue to lay out that long-range vision so that as a recovery eventually happens, we've already identified what we want to do with the resources that we will have available to provide mobility and transit services to the public. But I do, again, just want to emphasize that we understand how difficult this time is and that Onboard will eventually help play a role in the region's recovery. With that, we'll move in, next slide, please. We'll move into a quick review of the onboard strategies. So the onboard recommendations consist of 8 strategies called Big Moves and 64 specific projects or programs to implement those strategies. Other than some minor wordsmithing, these 8 strategies and the 64 specific projects are actually unchanged since last August. And because I've presented them to you multiple times since then, I will only briefly cover each one. But if you have questions, we can answer them at the end of my presentation. Next slide. So the first strategy is to build a high-capacity transit system. Onboard proposes 19 different high-capacity transit routes that would make up about 200 miles of system, and they would be implemented over multiple phases, over 2 primary phases. Next slide. Next strategy is to expand transit service to maximize access to jobs and housing. In the blue area, that's where the RTC currently operates high frequency transit, and the goal in that area would be to expand, add additional high frequency lines, and eventually increase frequency so that we eventually get off of the timetable, so people can just walk up to the bus stop, know that the next bus will be there within a few minutes, catch the bus and move on to their destination. In the darker gray area, that's where the RTC currently operates currently operates bus service. The goal there would be to decrease headways so that the waits between buses decrease, and then make more of those lines higher frequency, similar to what I just described for that blue area. In the light gray area is where, that's the urbanized part of the valley where the RTC does not currently have service, bus service at least. And so the goal there would be to provide some form of public transit or public mobility alternatives in those areas as well. So it could be extensions of bus lines, but it could also be on-demand type services, new types of micro or new types of mobility services, and then ride share partnerships, things like that. But those would all be developed and implemented um, uh, over time as individual projects in the plan are developed. Next slide. The next strategy is to make all travel options safer and more secure. Fairly straightforward, but what I do want to note is that this goes beyond just transit improvements. This improves, the bus stop safety, security improvements would carry benefits to the areas around bus stops, not just directly at the bus stops, and so there'd be some benefits there as well. And then the annual traffic crash review and countermeasure program, the first bullet point there, as a program would RTC would review traffic crashes over the previous year or maybe going back 5 years and work with the local agencies to identify and implement countermeasures. And it would be a very focused effort to try to address the hotspots for traffic crashes. Next slide. Next strategy is to make short trips easier. This one started out as improving first mile, last mile connections to transit. But as the onboard plan morphed into a mobility plan, and not as focused on transit services, it was really important that this strategy also evolved. And so it really became focused on improving the walkability, bikeability for the region, so that there's just a viable alternative for people if they want to walk or bike to a nearby location, shopping, or other activities, that they would have that alternative. Next slide. So this one is to expand service for older adults, veterans, and people with disabilities. Basically, the goal there, and this really is very much in conjunction with the coordinated plan that you just heard and approved. It's entirely compatible with that. But it's the goal there identified in this plan is to basically try to double the services that we have for older adults and veterans, and then find some way, again, funding dependent, to be able to expand service for people with disabilities so that it covers the entire urbanized part of the region. Next slide. Next strategy is to improve connections to major destinations. And so this includes trying to find ways to enhance service to and from the airport, as well as the special events that we operate to special event buses that we operate to major destinations like T-Mobile and soon to the football stadium. Next slide. This one is to provide reliable transit for resort corridor employees. It's a significant component of the region's population. About 25% of jobs in the region directly work in the resort corridor area. And the goal here is to provide express services from places where there are concentrations of resort corridor employees to the downtown and resort corridor area where we would have hubs at north and south ends and one in the middle, and then shuttles that run between the hubs and serve back of house entrances. So it's really intended to be to establish new and very reliable services for the workers down in the resort corridor area. Next slide. The last strategy is to leverage new technology to improve mobility. So this includes a gradual transition of the RTC's fleet to some form of electric vehicles, hydrogen or battery electric. It also includes implementation of the region's intelligent transportation system plan that our FAST department put together a few years ago. And then it also includes things that are really focused on improving sustainability, like developing a regional and highly visible electric vehicle charging network for the public. So those are the next slide. So those are the basic strategies. And like I said, I think everyone has seen them up to this point, but if folks have questions, happy to answer those at the end of the presentation. So one thing I want to say is it was important for us to understand the economic impacts and benefits that would come from the eventual implementation of ONBOARD. Next slide. So we looked at 4 basic types of economic impacts related to mobility and transit improvements. First were the spending impacts, or the multipliers, from the actual expenditure of funds. Next, the consultant team looked at the societal benefits and economic impacts. These are the type of benefits that result from, for example, the ability for customers to reach businesses where they otherwise wouldn't, or the ability of workers to be able to reach their jobs more reliably. Then finally are the land value and economic development impacts. These mostly relate to the increases in land value that typically occur after investments in fixed route transit infrastructure and operations. Next slide. The economic impact analysis basically boils down to the impacts that would come from the high capacity transit system and the impacts that would come from the other 7 strategies. You can see the summary here for the high capacity transit investments. And I just want to emphasize that these are estimates based on the potential spending that would come with investments on the scale it would take to actually develop a high capacity transit system. First, the basic multipliers for the different activities related to building a high capacity transit system are roughly 1.5 to 1.6. The societal benefits would exceed the investment costs over a 20-year period. The economic growth impacts would be more than $2 billion. And the land value impacts would be about a 1 to 6% increase in property values. And then you can see some of the other elements too. When you factor in the massive value of land within a half mile of those various high capacity transit routes, such an investment would generate a very large increase in land value. And just a reminder that the onboard plan itself has a similar analysis for the other 7 strategies. Next slide. So next I'll cover the results from the final onboard survey. As onboard was being finalized, we wanted to find out, hopefully to make sure, whether we, the project team, the consultants, the TAG, had effectively captured what the public thinks the region needs for mobility and transit. The online survey was conducted from January to March. People could view each of the 8 strategies, read a brief description of them, and read about the implementing projects. Then they were asked to rate each of the strategies on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. We received about 10,500 unique responses. Next slide. So this slide shows the overall ratings. All 8 of the recommended strategies received between 4.3 and 4.5 on that 5-point scale. I interpret that as a strong indicator that the strategies do reflect what we heard throughout all of the public engagement and technical work and collaboration with stakeholders. Next slide. This slide shows the number of responses for each rating and the 8 strategy for each rating that the 8 strategies received. So the overwhelming majority of them were 5 stars. Because 1 star is the lowest possible rating, we interpret that as no support or even opposition, but that was very low, averaging about 3%. Next slide. One of the demographic questions we asked was the zip code where respondents lived. This map shows that, and it also demonstrates that responses were spread across the valley. Other demographics that we asked about were income, race, age, and gender. So I won't linger too long on the next slides, but they show the results from some of the different demographic groupings. So next slide. First is income. You can see in this table how the survey matches very closely with Clark County as a whole. And then the survey, and then the chart shows how lower income respondents overall rated the onboard strategies a little bit higher than the overall responses, typically 1 or 2 points higher. Next. This slide shows how higher income respondents rated the mobility strategies, and it was generally a little bit lower than the overall survey respondents. Next slide. So next, we just briefly show the race and ethnicity demographics and responses. On average, racial and ethnic minorities rated the onboard recommendations a bit higher than the overall survey group. And then next slide. So this slide shows a summary of the responses from a larger set of different demographic breakouts. And I'll leave it here for just a couple of seconds. Okay. Next, I'll briefly review a prioritization exercise that we conducted with the technical advisory group back in late February. As the onboard recommendations were out for public comment through the final survey, we wanted to also start preparing for the next step of figuring out what the top priorities should be for the eventual implementation of onboard by the RTC with our local government partners. So next slide. So we conducted a revealed preference exercise with the TAG, the Technical Advisory Group, where they were given a budget and asked to allocate it to the projects they most supported. And although this was not technically part of the onboard plan and it is not included in the final plan, it was an important first step for us to make sure that onboard does not sit on a shelf after it's approved. Our goal is to implement the plan, and whether that's small things in the plan being implemented with the very limited resources we have available now, or whether it's the large and sweeping vision of onboard that can be implemented in the future as we recover from the recession and additional resources, start to become available. So next slide. So the last topic I'll cover are the final steps and timeline as we carry onboard through to approval by the RTC board. Next. So since the consultant contract ended at the end of June, we've been meeting with each of the local governments in the Valley to review the plan and recommendations. We've also held a series of virtual drop-in briefings with the TAG participants. Today's presentation to this committee and the staff recommendation to approve the onboard strategies and recommendations is the first step towards final approval of the plan by the RTC board. After your action today, which again, hopefully results in a recommendation for approval, we will take these recommendations to the Executive Advisory Committee later this month and then for an informational presentation to the RTC board in August. The next steps after that are actually still somewhat fluid, but will probably consist of developing some type of cost estimates and a hypothetical funding mechanism, which would then probably go to the board along with the plan and recommendations in October or November for final board approval. Then onboard will also become an appendix to the regional transportation plan, and all of the projects will be included, well, most of the projects will be included as unfunded projects in the next regional transportation plan, which will be adopted in December or January. And after that, we move on working with the local governments towards implementation. Next slide. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Craig. Are there any questions from the subcommittee? I hear none. If there are no questions or comments, do we have a motion on the floor?
This is Fred Solis for the record. Move for approval.
We have a motion for approval. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any
Aye.
opposed? Any opposed? I don't hear anybody. The motion carries. Mr. Rayburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item on the agenda is to receive an update on the Regional Planning Work Program. As of the 2020 to 2021 Unified Planning Work Program Second Amendment that we passed back in February, there are now 2 tasks relating to the MPO's role as the core administrator of the Southern Nevada Strong Regional Policy Plan. So Ms. Ray Lathrop, Manager of Regional Planning, will present an update on the progress of specific tasks relating to that regional work program, and she'll highlight recent findings on the sustainability plan inventory and some of the projects that we're doing with this effort.
Thank you, Craig. Good morning, Ray Lathrop for the record. Yes, we've now been included in the UPWP work program, and so we'll be providing periodic updates to the MPS subcommittee. In the May meeting, we presented our new work program and several projects that we've begun this year. Today, we will present some more intermediary findings. We can go to the next slide. Just as a very quick reminder, this first task included in the UPWP is inclusive of everything that we call regional policy plan administration. So you'll recall in May, we talked about the community engagement toolkit, as well as the review and update of the downtown North Las Vegas opportunity site. Both of those projects fall underneath this, as well as our day-to-day responsibilities of administering the regional policy plan. And next slide. So today we'll focus on some findings related to the future housing inventory and needs study, the extreme heat event study, and the inventory of regional sustainability planning tools and techniques. Our goal as the regional planning team is to provide technical support and research so that all of our regional partners can implement the regional plan. This role is only feasible if we're in conversation and collaboration with all of our local jurisdictions and community stakeholders. So to that end, we're going to continue to provide some of these findings and updates, as well as now we're convening some technical advisory groups so as to have some more subject matter expert response and feedback as we continue to move forward. So first, on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the future housing inventory and needs study, where we're really looking at the regional housing supply. Of course, this is a very complicated proposal as the future inventory and demand are drastically impacted by many components like population and employment forecasts, future long-range planning, and the housing market, as well as other economic and demographic trends. It should be noted that as we started to analyze historic and some forecast information, we realized that many things have the potential to drastically change given the impact of the current pandemic. But until any projected data is updated, we're just going to use what has been published so far in the region. So as we began to look at historical data, this graph is kind of an example of some of the work that we've been putting together. It doesn't tell the whole story, but it does give us a nice historic context of our housing and population growth. So the orange line is the population over the last 30 years, and the bar graph is housing permits issued annually. Of course, around 2007, housing permits really fall off while our population continued to increase. And we know that housing permits don't really equal new production for that same year, but you can see kind of how our community has been growing. We've also collected a lot of information around affordability, types of homes, and other metrics that may help us understand the local context. So within the concept of future housing supply and demand, the technical advisory group that we will be pulling together is going to help us really think about what is the most relevant and timely question at this moment, and what kind of products should we be producing to help the local planning staff. While we haven't met yet, some of the questions, some of the questions that we're looking forward to kind of diving into is both, is seen here on this screen. Excuse me, hold on 1 second. Sorry about that, guys. We found some intriguing research that we're really interested in replicating. And some of that is here. So first, Washington, D.C. has done some extensive research in defining local jobs to housing ratio. They use that tool to more adequately look at future supply. Our community doesn't have a set goal around jobs and housing ratio, and so that's one of the first questions that we might want to explore. SPUR, which is a Bay Area planning and urban research organization, has looked at local and future incomes to determine the prices of homes that would then contribute to a rent or mortgage burden. And then working backwards, they can determine the number of units at each price point that a community should be building. And, you know, affordability and access to adequate housing is a major goal of the regional plan. And so we think that that's kind of worth digging into, but very separate and different than the jobs housing balance. And then finally, we found that Reno looked at housing preference surveys to identify the demand of housing by type as reported by very diverse respondents. And then they were able to make up kind of what their future population would look like and what that would demand as far as the housing mix. So again, diversifying housing is also a big part of the regional plan. So we have three really kind of different questions that we're asking, and just when we build a technical advisory group, we will be kind of trying to prioritize and figure out what needs to come first. Next slide, just to give you a little bit of example why we need some expert help on kind of figuring out what's first. If you look at this graph, we're kind of very preliminarily put some lines together as far as future land use projections and planned residential units. But as you can see, the difference between the housing needs in the green line would be a 1.25 jobs to housing units balance, whereas the blue line would be a 1.5 jobs to housing units. So over time, depending on how we set that goal, we could see a gap and or an oversupply. So those are the types of things that we're going to need some technical review and support with. Next, after our initial research and conversation, including with several, I skipped ahead. Onto the extreme heat and vulnerability study. And we all know that Nevada is warming, and while we may not be able to stop that extreme warming, we can react in a couple of different ways to save lives. We can increase the awareness about heat risks, we can develop effective responses, and we can invest in adaptation or mitigation strategies. During our initial data collection, we found studies that look at the range of data points that could contribute to the effect that heat have on people, exacerbating of heat by the natural or built environment, and mitigation of heat through policies and programs. After our initial research and conversations, including a lot with the School of Public Health, we started to analyze the analysis of understanding that while all Southern Nevadans are impacted by extreme heat events, these impacts are not evenly distributed. Certain communities in our region will be particularly affected based on the level of exposure, the sensitivity to that heat exposure, and the ability to adapt during extreme heat events. So to go to the next slide, we've actually done some very preliminary research on this. And this is, again, just a very first take at a composite map that looks at temperature, land cover, land developed or undeveloped, and elevation. You can see that the downtown and the east parts of the valley kind of have at this point in this analysis, kind of some expected higher impacts of heat. So we are hoping to develop a map of the three separate determinants: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptability, that will ultimately feed into the extreme heat map overall. And we'll be working closely with our technical assistance, technical advisory group to ensure that we've chosen adequate indicators and the appropriate data and the spatial analysis of that data to build some very relevant maps. And lastly, our last project is on the inventory of regional sustainability planning tools and techniques. So last time we met, we actually shared a lot of detail on what had been happening in this study. We started with the goal to better understand how sustainability planning has occurred in other regions. Two main questions that guided this research was, are there standard approaches to sustainability planning, and what are best practices for that planning? So we did both literature review as well as direct interviews with other communities about how they approached that experience in sustainability planning. We talked with Tempe, the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council, Triangle Council of Governments, and Western Riverside Council of Governments. We distilled our findings into two broad categories, and we've completed a draft report. There is a planning website on this, a project website that we've created underneath the transportation planning page on the RTC site, and we'll make sure if you want to see any of that research, it's been published. Generally, we found that sustainability planning occurs either at the local level or collaboratively as a region. There are pros and cons to each of these approaches, which our report dives into at a more detailed level. And each can yield positive results. The literature that we found was very optimistic on strong regional collaboration around sustainability planning, but regional approaches are kind of new to this field, and there hasn't been a lot of time to evaluate the effectiveness overall. But through the interviews that we conducted and various considerations and best practices emerged in this work, again, they're all found in our draft report and then grouped into some of the categories on foundation of planning, the process of the planning, and the general components that are found throughout regional sustainability plans. We have met with a technical advisory group twice now to obtain some feedback and some further direction. In the first meeting, we gained really valuable feedback for finalizing the research, and the committee advised us to include additional detail about social and environmental justice into our report and how planning for justice can overlap with sustainability planning. We really appreciated that feedback and took it to heart and really looked for it in our second draft of the report. We're adding more detail and also including some ideas around how other communities partnered with external agencies like nonprofits or for-profit businesses to increase the outcome of their sustainability plans. And so the technical advisory group has really helped us with that. Again, that final draft, the draft report and the research that we did on the sustainability planning tools is on a project website that I believe is live or will be very soon. And so that concludes my update. A lot of advancement on several of these research projects. We're happy to share with them. I have the team here if anyone has specific questions about any of them, or if you're interested in serving on a technical advisory group or learning more about a project particularly, feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you, Ray. Are there any comments or questions from the subcommittee? I hear none. If there are no more questions or comments, we can move on to the next item. Mr. Rayburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item on the agenda is to receive the final report on the school trip generation study. Mr. Andrew Kelman, Manager of Transportation Planning, will provide the report.
Thank you, Craig. Andrew Kelman for the record. This study is currently included in the Unified Planning Work Program. The general purpose of this study is to better understand the differences between school trip generation rates commonly used in the Institute of Transportation Engineers Trip Generation Manual, also called ITE, and this collects data at a national level. And we wanted to compare those to those observed locally here in Southern Nevada. For some background, local agencies have observed that the ITE national rates do not provide an accurate estimate for volumes of vehicle traffic at local public and charter schools. Local agencies often observe a higher number of students arriving and departing by automobile than what was anticipated using ITE rates. The study began 2 years ago and is now complete. The executive summary of the report is included in the agenda packet, and the final report is now available on the RTC website. Next slide, please. So for an overview of the project, the objective was essentially to conduct research specific to the localized context to better understand school trip generation rates for all transportation modes. This has the resulting study goal of providing recommendations that will improve the accuracy of forecasting school trip generation rates to be used for site planning, development, and permitting of proposed new schools. Next slide, please. So as part of the review of existing studies, the study started with an analysis of the most commonly referenced ITE rates nationally. So as you can see in this chart, at the bottom of this table, highlighted in yellow, is the small sample size used for the charter elementary school rate, and it's flagged for its small sample size to generate that rate. So the bottom yellow cell there. That means that the resulting trip forecast used nationally for new charter elementary schools is not very reliable. So this provided another justification for completing the study because of the growing prevalence of charter schools locally. Next slide. The study also included an analysis of on-site queuing. And so what that is the storage of vehicles for school pickup and drop off on site. As part of this effort, a review of existing queuing studies completed locally was conducted. Next slide. For study outreach, it was primarily focused on coordination with community stakeholders, and a technical advisory committee was formed. The TAC was comprised primarily of local agency traffic engineers, but it also included NDOT and CCSD. And a big part of the outreach effort was coordinating with school administrators, primarily school principals, to coordinate the data collection effort and to understand any existing traffic or operational issues they have observed near their school sites. Next slide. In coordination with the Technical Advisory Committee, the study selected 20 schools in Southern Nevada to collect data. This included 8 charter schools, 6 public elementary schools, and 6 public middle schools. These schools were spread around the valley, with 6 in Henderson, 6 in the city of Las Vegas, 6 in North Las Vegas, and 2 in unincorporated Clark County. Next slide, please. For each school, a data collection plan was created. School counts occurred during the previous year, so in 2018 and 2019. Counts were conducted for a 4-hour period, morning and afternoon, and that count period was extended for charter schools with multiple bell times. It also included documenting vehicles parked off-site and students walking into the school, buses, pedestrians, bikes, scooters, and parking occupancy levels. Next slide. This is an example of how site-specific data collection plans were developed for each of the 20 school sites to account for how different access points are for every school. So all of these plans were approved by the local agency and the school administrator. Next slide. For data analysis, 3 independent variables were collected for each school. They were the number of students, number of employees at the school, and the overall building size. All of these are consistent with current methods used by the national ITE. Next slide. For these 3 independent variables, the number of students was found to be the most statistically significant, with a very tight-fitting curve. It was observed that the number of employees and building size can vary greatly between sites with very similar trip patterns. Next slide. This slide provides a summary result of the study. It shows the trip generation rate comparison for Southern Nevada schools with the national ITE rate. So the ITE rate is the brown color for the different school types. with the local rates for the same school types listed below. It uses the number of students as the independent variable. All Southern Nevada trip rates were observed to be higher than the national ITE trip generation rates. The only exception to this was charter schools in the AM peak hour, where the ITE rate is 1.14. That's that top cell in brown. And the Southern Nevada rate for all charter schools was 1 trip per student. So that's the only case where the local trip rate was lower than the national rate. Next slide. For on-site queuing, the observed maximum queues at Southern Nevada charter schools range from 0.01 to 0.31 vehicles per student. And this is consistent with previous studies conducted locally. And it's also worth noting that 4 of the schools observed had queues that backed up into the public street. Next slide. This is an example of an on-site queue for Doral Academy, which is located on Cactus Avenue. It shows multiple lanes of vehicle storage, and that storage is necessary to gain the linear feet needed to accommodate the total queue. But it's worth noting that even with this multi-lane storage area wrapping around the school perimeter, observations during this study of this school site still identified cars parked in adjacent lots and along the street. So vehicles did not choose to enter that queue. Next slide, please. For a few other observations identified during data collection, the observation team identified prohibited U-turns in school zones, and parking in surrounding neighborhoods was common. And that parking in surrounding neighborhoods was common even when a vehicle queue area was available. Next slide. For study findings, the findings are that the number of students is the most statistically significant and reliable variable to use when forecasting trip generation rates in Southern Nevada. However, the final report does include rates for employees and building size as well. And importantly, the observed trip generation rates in Southern Nevada were higher than the national ITE rate for all school types, with the only exception being for charter schools during the morning. Next slide. And finally, for study recommendations, the locally determined school trip generation rates are now available for use, and local agencies can review them and determine what trip generation rates to use for new school planning and permitting. There are also some operational recommendations related to on-site queuing, preventing U-turns in school zones, and promoting safe routes to school. The results of the study will be submitted to ITE for inclusion in future updates to the National Trip Generation Manual. And finally, the RTC is also encouraging future school trip generation information gathered locally to be reported back to us so that we can continually incorporate that data into this current data set. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. Are there any comments or questions from the subcommittee? I hear none. We move to the next item. Mr. Rayburn.
Thank you, Chair Kara Panagiatis. Craig Rayborn, again for the record. Next item on the agenda is to receive a report on the planning variables for the Regional Transportation Plan. Travel demand forecasting is an essential tool used by the RTC to forecast future regional travel conditions and estimate future transportation system needs that guide the development of the Regional Transportation Plan, or the RTP. Ms. Lee-Jan Su, Senior Transportation Planner, will provide this update.
Thank you, Craig. This is Lee-Jan Su for the records. Yeah. As Greg just said, RTC travel demand forecast model is an essential tool to estimate future transportation conditions for RTC regional transportation plan development. The most important inputs to the RTC travel demand forecast model are number of employment, number of population, number of dwelling unit, and other social economic data for current and for future. We call them planning variables. Today, I'm going to make a short presentation on the development of future projections for those planning variables. Next slide, please. Planning variable development is a collective planning process of coordination and collaboration through land use working group activities. Land use working group consists of land use professionals and community planners from City of Las Vegas, City of Henderson, City of North Las Vegas, Clark County, CCSD, airports, Nellis Air Force Base, Water District Authority, and the RTC. Next slide. We have conducted 5 land use working group meetings since April 2nd, 2019. When necessary, RTC communicated with entities through one-on-one meetings, emails, and conference calls to discuss on data requirements, future projection methods, and redevelopment topics. Land use working group members reviewed, discussed, and provided feedbacks to validate the future projections. At the last meeting on July 9th, RTC gave the final presentation to the land use working group. Next slide, please. Future year population projections start with base year condition and based on future Clark County population forecasts by CBER and the future available land projected by local entities. Data source for base year population was from GILA's 2019 dataset provided by Clark County Department of Comprehensive Planning. The future year population was projected based on the planned land use provided by each entity. The planned land use was based on approved plans by each entity by July 1st, 2019. It was in 5-year increments from 2020 to 2050 and was parcel-based. It has 9 land use categories. Residential has 2 categories. Non-residential has 7 categories. Next slide, please. The table on the bar chart shows the acreage that would be developed by 2050. City of Henderson projected more residential developable land, and the City of North Las Vegas projected more vacant land for industrial development. Next slide, please. The map shows planned land use from 2020 to 2050. It shows where the new development will be. Most of development will happen in the suburbs. The yellow represents single family. Dark red is for multifamily, and the orange is for industrial. Blue is for non-retail other. Next slide, please. This slide lists the population projection procedures. Using the available land use data, the dwelling units are calculated first. Number of occupied dwelling units are calculated by using occupancy rate. Then population growth is calculated by multiplying occupied dwelling units with the household size. Total population is calculated by adding population growth to base year population. We use CBER population projections as the control total. After comparing with the CBER population projection, we adjusted occupancy rates to match CBER population projection. Next slide, please. Those tables and charts show the results before and after adjustment has been made. The red line is for zebra population, and the green line is for RTC projection. We can see two lines are getting closer after adjustment. Next slide. The tables show the projected dwelling unit growth and the projected population growth from 2019 to 2050. The dwelling units will increase by 432,000, and the projected population will grow by 678,000. Next slide, please. The bar charts on this slide provide a visual presentation of the growth by entity from last slide. Next slide. This slide presents projected total dwelling unit and the total population for each horizon year. In 2050, we could have 3 million people in the valley. Next slide, please. The line charts on this slide are created from the tables on slide 11 to have a visual representation of growth trend by entity. Next slide. Base year employment data and the development of future year projection are different from the ones for population and the housing unit projections. Data source for base year employment is data 2019 second quarter data. The future year employment were based on planned land use, CBOR forecast employment growth rates, projected population growth pattern near a long-term industry plans, projections from local entities, and redevelopment information. Next slide, please. The table and the bar chart on this slide show the employment summary by industrial category for the base year. The following industrial have largest employment share of the region. Food and drinking services account for 10% of total employment. Hotel with gaming jobs account for 14%. Private office account for 17%. Other industry account for 15%. And the retail account for 12%. Next slide. The procedures for future employment development are as follows. First, examine the base year employment by industrial distribution and by entity distribution. Calculate growth rates from CBOR employment projections. Second, calculate future employment growth by applying CBOR growth rate to data 2019 employment. Allocation is based on population growth pattern. Third, allocate future employment growth to vacant non-residential land projected by entity. The last, add employment for special generators, redevelopment, and specific employment projected by local entities. Zone-specific adjustments were made by employment category based on inputs from City of North Las Vegas and the City of Henderson. Next slide, please. This table presents the employment projections by entities In 2050, the total employment would be 1.3 million. Next slide. The two maps in this slide are the total population and the total employment growth from 2019 to 2050. Most of the population growth are located in the outskirts of Las Vegas Valley. Most of the employment growth are in Nellis Air Force Base and the APAC area. The next two slides have maps showing the areas with the employment growth breakdown by industry. Next slide. The map on the left shows 2019 to 2050 job growth for hotel with gaming and without gaming. The map on the right shows 2019 to 2050 job growth for food, drink, retail, wholesale, or the supermarket. Next slide. The map on the left shows 2019 to 2050 industrial job growth. The map on the right shows 2019 to 2050 all other non-retail job growth. Next slide. Okay. The methodology and the procedure used in the development of planning variables are documented and will be posted on the RTC website. This concludes my report. I will answer any questions the subcommittee has. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz Juan. Are there any comments or questions from the subcommittee? If there are no more questions or comments, we can move on to the next item. Mr. Rayburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Craig Rayburn for the record. The next item is to receive an update on the Stadium District Transportation Plan. Mr. Jared Tasco with the Clark County Comprehensive Planning Department will provide an update on the plan.
We have Mr. Tasco on.
Jared, I see that your hand is raised. Your line is unmuted and you can begin presenting. Jared, again, your line is unmuted. If you could please start.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present. Jared Tasco with Clark County Comprehensive Planning. So I appreciate the opportunity to provide an update to the Metropolitan Planning Subcommittee. Next slide. So this is an overview of the project area that we are focusing on. So the area in purple is what we are looking at in terms of land use, and then we're also focusing on a wider area in terms of transportation in and out of the stadium district. Next slide. So to date, we have had 2 stakeholder committee meetings as well as 2 public surveys. And what we have learned from these groups so far is we've really wanted to gain a better understanding of what the district should look like, different scenarios for the development of land as it transitions from the existing industrial uses to what we anticipate as more hospitality and entertainment related uses related to the stadium. We did a SWOT analysis of the different land use scenarios, and we also developed vision and goals for the stadium district. And what we're currently working on is we're in the final stages of developing street typologies and cross sections, and we're going to have a third technical advisory working group to provide us with feedback on these different street types. And I have some samples and examples of those towards the end of this presentation. Next slide. So along with our stakeholders and through our survey, we developed this vision for the stadium district. We want to create a dynamic district with a comprehensive mix of uses that supports the continuation of current businesses while providing opportunities to transition into a thriving destination for entertainment, hospitality, business, and sports. So our vision statement recognizes the fact that we have an active industrial area with viable businesses located there now that operate and support our casino industries as well as other aspects of our economy. And we don't want to disrupt that, but we do want to provide for the opportunity as the needs arise to transition to more entertainment and hospitality related businesses related to the stadium and how both of those uses can work harmoniously together. Next slide. So the goals that we've developed with the stadium district stakeholders, as well as through our surveys and the general public, is we want to enhance the quality of life and create a vibrant district, promote a vibrant economy, and promote flexibility in the district for both game days and non-game day events. So we understand the Raiders and concerts and different events are going to happen throughout the year, but we really want to create the opportunity for businesses that thrive in the district on non-game days as well. And also provide connectivity and access to and throughout the district for different mobility options. Next slide. So this is a scenario. You can probably click the forward one more time, please. So assisting, yeah, that works. So our land use plan is going to assist with the transition of the area around the stadium. We want to promote cohesive development, and also this is going to lay the foundation for future code changes to the Clark County Development Code. So right now, this is a visionary document, and it's aspirational for what we think will occur in the future, and it's going to help lay down the guidelines for what direction and what key steps we need to take in order to achieve that vision. And one of those steps that we anticipate is for this to lay the foundation for an overlay district that we then are going to incorporate as another project after this into the stadium district area. So as the different property owners redevelop, they potentially would have to comply with new design standards, and we could provide them with incentives to do that. Next slide, please. So based on our technical advisory meetings, this is just one potential scenario that shows how some of the area around this immediately adjacent to the stadium is going to potentially transition to more hotel, restaurant, hospitality types of uses. And then as it progresses more to the west and southwest adjacent to the railroad tracks, we anticipated, based on the feedback that we received, that those areas will remain largely industrial. So this is not regulatory in any means. It just helps us provide us with input as we develop our policies of what we can potentially expect the area to look like years down the line. Next slide. So this is some key elements of the transportation plan that we are including in our final report. Next slide. So we've done an existing conditions analysis for the stadium district so far, and it presently meets all of the needs for the industrial types of uses that exist there now. However, we understand that we're going to need to overcome some of the challenges as that area transitions to different entertainment and hospitality types of uses. So some of the things that we found that it currently lacks a human scale, and that's to be expected. I mean, the area was designed for industrial uses, semi-trucks, wide streets, minimal accommodations for pedestrians beyond a standard 5-foot attached sidewalk. The street lighting is also designed for vehicles and not for pedestrians. Parking locations are generally located in front of the buildings, so that helps, so that has a negative impact on the quality of the pedestrian experience. There's a lot of driveways and curb cuts, so we really want to focus on access management to help cut down on the frequency of driveways, to help reduce the type of impact that's going to have in conflict points with pedestrians as more pedestrians frequent that area. We also want to improve the quality of the sidewalks and accessibility and safety for pedestrian crossings. Next slide. And lastly, before we move into some other aspects of the presentation, one of the areas that we're focusing on is to help reduce the overall block length. So we have kind of an unconnected grid in that area. And by focusing and creating policies and strategies to help connect that grid, we can help shorten the walking distances for pedestrians, provide better connectivity, improve access, improve safety, and help reduce vehicle speeds. Next slide. So this slide depicts existing and potential future street and pedestrian access points and that traverse the district. So the dotted green lines represent potential pedestrian pathways. And it's a little bit hard to see on this slide, but there are dashed tan lines for the neighborhood streets. And so if you removed the dashed lines, you'd really see that there's area around the district has a lot of cul-de-sacs and dead-end streets and streets that are not very well connected and not conducive to the type of activity that's going to occur there for game day events. And so we really want to create a set of policies to help complete this grid network. In addition, the slide represents the hierarchy of different streets that we've designated for the area. So each one of these streets, we're creating different design guidelines that will cater towards how we expect the street to function and the type of activities that will occur on the different streets. Next slide. So we have a couple of examples for you. This is just one example of a neighborhood street typology. We're in the final stages of developing these street typologies. We just got feedback from Clark County Public Works, and once we incorporate their input, we have a few minor changes to make on our diagrams. This is going to be the basis for what we're going to present to our stakeholders at the TAC 3 meeting. So we have about a dozen of these, but we just included 2 of them in the presentation today for display purposes. But to give you an idea of our thought process for a neighborhood street, currently this would accommodate semi-trucks and a lot of traffic related to the industrial uses. But if those uses were to change, how would the ideal street function? And you can see we would have one travel lane in each direction, followed by bike lanes and on-street parking. And then this, if you look across the top of the screen, the existing 60-foot right-of-way, the only thing this would involve is restriping the existing street. So there's really no drastic physical infrastructure changes that would be involved in this, just restriping the street for different types of uses to accommodate the different types of uses in the district. However, when you look at where the existing right-of-way ends and where it changes from public property to private property, this is where our overlay district is going to come into play. And we're developing strategies so when these properties redevelop on private property, we hopefully would create new standards that they would be required to put in a 5-foot amenity zone with landscaping, benches, and lighting, followed by a 10-foot wide clear path. And you can see if you combine that 15 feet on-site with the 6 feet in the public right-of-way, you're going to get a 20-foot plus 21-foot wide amenity area for pedestrians. And this is going to really help the number of pedestrians that are going to traverse the area, as well as help create more of a Main Street feel where people are going to want to spend time before and after events and facilitate events in the area, even on non-game days. And the last thing I want to point out is we want to focus on the massing of the buildings. And so the buildings, if you look at the far right or left side of the screen, the building would be pulled up to the back edge of that pedestrian clear path. And so this will help facilitate more of a pedestrian enjoyable experience rather than what you see now, which is the typical suburban or industrial development, where you have the existing sidewalk, followed by landscaping adjacent to that, followed by parking lot, and then the building set pretty far back. And so it really accommodates vehicles rather than pedestrians. So this is just an example of how we want to see the area potentially transition. And keep in mind, how we want to see it is based on feedback from the stakeholders, as well as the public that we've received from our surveys. Next slide, please. And this is an example. We have two streets that we've designated as multimodal streets in the district, and that's Valley View and Russell Road. And this is just one scenario. We've created multiple scenarios for each one of the different street typologies that we're going to present to the stakeholders. And you can see in this scenario, we would have a 14-foot or potentially a 12-foot wide landscape median, followed by 2 travel lanes in each direction, followed by transit routes that would also accommodate bicycles. And then it would also have the existing 5-foot wide sidewalk. So we kept the same scenario because most of the sidewalks actually are existing in that area. And so rather than removing the existing attached sidewalks, changing the underground utilities that are in that area, we wanted to create some options that would help accommodate the change of uses, but also recognize how the area has currently evolved and minimize the amount of, changes that are necessary to accommodate the new uses. Next slide. So next steps. We are, like I mentioned, we're in the final stages of developing the remainder of our street typologies, and then we hope to present those to a stakeholder meeting in August. So I think that we're going to be right around the corner. We'll be sending out notices to our stakeholders shortly. After we have that technical advisory group meeting to review the street typologies, we're going to start developing the draft plan. So we're really going to have a lot of information based on existing conditions, land use scenarios, design standards, as well as street typologies. We're going to put that all into the draft plan, present that to our stakeholders, and we'll also be back to show you a summary of that for the Metropolitan Planning Subcommittee. And then we're going to move into the final plan stages and then bring that forward to the elected and appointed officials for Clark County for adoption, and then also the RTC elected and appointed officials. Next slide, and with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jared. Are there any comments or questions from the subcommittee? Chairman Dimitrios Karapanagotis, for the record, I have a question for Jared. Is there any appetite from the property owners, the stakeholders around there, to create like a special tax district or something like that in order to finance, these projects down the road?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, yeah, absolutely. And so that's one of the things we're going to discuss at our next meeting. We discussed those options with Public Works and found out more information about what would be required to create a special improvement district. And what we found out so far that if less than 50% of the property owners are in opposition, basically if the majority of them support the idea, we can help facilitate and initiate a special improvement district to help pay for some of these improvements in that area so that it doesn't happen piecemeal. We're not waiting for the area to transition first and then after the fact, whether we can be proactive about it. So that is one scenario, and we're going to discuss that with the stakeholders. So far we've heard bits and pieces of information, but I think we'll have a more formalized discussion about that at our next stakeholder meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
Johanna Murphy, hi. I have one question for Jared. I'm not that familiar with this area. Is the majority of the land that you're planning around undeveloped or developed?
Hi, Joanna. Yeah. The majority of the area is all developed as industrial uses. So it's mostly office, warehouse, metal buildings. So there's a lot of existing functioning business there's now, I don't think there's very many vacant parcels, if any. And so it really would deal more with a transition of the existing uses to new, different types of uses related to stadium type of activities.
Oh, okay, so then you'll have to be working with the individual property owners to create those amenity zones and larger sidewalks on their individual properties?
Yeah, that's correct. And so it would be a function of when the property decides to redevelop. So unfortunately, it's going to be probably more of a piecemeal approach long term.
Okay.
But as properties redevelop, then once we get our new design overlay standards in place, after this vision is adopted, they would develop to those new pedestrian realm requirements to have the wider walkway, the landscape area adjacent to the street. We don't have any, and then also I guess the SID is an option for that as well if the property owners decide and they want to see some improvements and go down, that's another potential way. But more than likely, I think it'll be developed with each property owner as they come in and want to change the uses on the site, rebuild, from the existing office warehouse uses to something else.
Okay, so that's what you are envisioning, future redevelopment. And that's why you were showing some of those buildings to be able to be right at the back of that amenity zone then. Right?
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
they're not located there now. Most of them are
Right.
set back. And so, but if they come in the future, potentially, we'd have like a maximum setback instead of a minimum setback.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks.
Sure, you're welcome.
Anybody else have a question? I hear none. We can move on to the next item, Mr. Rayburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Craig Rayborn for the record. Our next item is to receive regional staff updates. So this is an opportunity for subcommittee members to share updates or information with other members.
Is there anything that a member of the subcommittee would like to share?
Mr. Chair,
I hear none. Oh.
well, Mr. Chair, this is Craig Rayborn from RTC again, just for the record. It's not really an update, but I do want to just take a moment to acknowledge, I think this is the second one of these MPS meetings that we've held remotely. So I want to take a minute to acknowledge and thank the RTC team that helps pull these meetings together. Eileen Pastor, who we heard from earlier, Maren Dubois, who we heard from earlier, and then on this meeting, David Gloria has been running the slideshow for us. And I just want to note and acknowledge the effort that they've been putting into making these meetings pull off mostly hitchless, most of the hitches being caused by either me or my team.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment, and I saw a lot of the staff, also worked, the weekend. So yeah, would totally appreciate, their effort, So if there are no other comments, Mr. Rayburn, we can move on to the next item.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last item on the agenda is your final citizens participation.
This is the second time set aside for public comment. Just a reminder that comments will be limited to the first 5 words, with the remaining words to be included in the written record. Do we have any comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Eileen Pastor, RTC Government Affairs Supervisor for the record, and there are no public comments.
Okay, thank you. If there are no additional comments, I will close the item. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Please stay safe, wear your masks, keep your distance, and if there is nothing else, then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.